Oxford, 1923. A palm-sized clay prism arrives at the Ashmolean Museum. 4 sides, hollow center, built to rotate on a wooden spindle. Catalogued AN 1923.444. A King List, administrative, routine. But one column does not record kings. It records intervals, 8 of them, all exact multiples of the same astronomical unit. The total, 432,000 years. When alternative researchers calculate the cycle and divide, the window they arrive at does not end in the ancient past. Why would a royal archive engineer a document to spin and embed inside it a number that 4 separate civilizations all attach to the end of the world? The label said nothing alarming. It never does. That is how the dangerous ones survive, not locked away, not burned, not buried in a sealed chamber, just labeled correctly and placed behind glass where no one lowers their voice. The prism was excavated at Larsa, in what is now southern Iraq, in 1922. Herbert Weld-Blundell funded the expedition. The prism was brought to Oxford the following year and catalogued as part of his collection. It is baked clay, yellowish-brown, roughly the size of a thick television remote, 8 columns of cuneiform pressed into its 4 faces. The Ashmolean describes it in 2 calm paragraphs. A King List, the most complete surviving version of the Sumerian King List. That is what the label says. That is what almost everyone who has ever stood in front of it has read and believed and walked away from. What the label does not say is that the prism was built on a spindle, not placed on a spindle, built around one. The hollow runs the full length of the clay, precisely enough to thread a wooden rod through the center, so all 4 faces could rotate past a reader in sequence. This was not a document meant to be shelved. It was meant to be turned, every column, in order, by someone who needed to read all of it. That detail does not appear on the museum card. You would need to read the cataloging notes. The prism lists 8 kings who ruled before a great flood. Their names are recorded, their cities are recorded, and their reigns are recorded in lengths that no human being could have lived. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000 years. 6 more after that. The total, depending on which version you consult, is either 241,200 years or 432,000 years. Mainstream scholars have a clear and coherent answer for this. The Sumerians used a base 60 number system, sexagesimal, where counting units called sar and nir produced numbers that look astronomical but were never meant literally. The large numbers express divine favor, scribal convention, mythological prestige. The reigns are symbolic. The kings are either legendary or composite figures standing in for long dynasties. That explanation is rational. It held for roughly 100 years. Then someone started dividing. 432,000 divided by 3,600, the Sumerian unit called a sar, equals 120. Exactly. No remainder, clean. That alone proves nothing. But 432,000 also appears somewhere else, not in another Sumerian text. In the Norse Eddas, 540 halls in Valhalla, each containing 800 warriors, assembled before Ragnarok. 540 multiplied by 800 is 432,000. The Hindu Kali Yuga, the final age before cosmic destruction in Vedic cosmology, lasts 432,000 years. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in Greek around 290 BCE, 15 centuries after the prism was pressed, records 10 antediluvian kings with a total reign of 432,000 years, independently of the Weld-Blundell version, in a different language, in a different empire, for a different audience. You know how some numbers feel like coincidence the first time. The second time you start checking your math. The third time, you check the sources. By the fourth, you are not sure what you are looking at anymore. The mainstream answer is still available here. Base 60 mathematics is a highly composite system, and 432,000 is simply a very clean, very divisible number that different cultures could reach independently through astronomical observation. The number is convenient, not encoded, not transmitted, convenient. That answer is possible. It is also the answer that requires the most to be coincidental, but the numbers are only the beginning of the problem. The prism's text does not end when the flood arrives. It passes through it. The exact line reads, "After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven a second time, Kish became the seat of kingship." A second time, not for the first time, not after the flood was over and the world resumed. After kingship descended from heaven for the second time. The first descent is listed at the beginning of the document, before Alulim, before any of the 8 kings, in the opening lines of the prism. Kingship came down once. The world ran for 241,200 years. The flood came. Kingship came down again, and the second era began. The safe reading is that this is poetic framing, literary convention. The scribes were legitimizing later dynasties by connecting them to a mythological origin. The second descent is symbolic, not sequential, but the text does not say it is symbolic. It says it happened twice, and it gives both events dates. If this were only a rhetorical device, why give the first descent a number? Why include the duration of the first era at all? Why engineer a document to rotate if the content was only ceremonial? The strange part is not that the text is dramatic. The frightening part is that it is not dramatic at all. The scribes record the flood the same way they record everything else. One line, past tense, then the next king. There is a second document. Most people who discuss the Sumerian King List have never read it alongside the prism. It is older, it is longer, and it describes the same pre-flood world in detail the King List does not have space for. It is called the Atrahasis epic, written down in the mid-17th century BCE, but based on oral tradition that scholars agree is substantially older. It describes 3 catastrophes that arrive before the flood, each separated by roughly 1,200 years. First, a plague. Humanity survives because the god Enki warns them in time. Then drought. Humanity survives again with Enki's help. Then famine. Again they survive. The fourth event is different. The fourth event requires something none of the previous 3 did. An ark, a sealed vessel, loaded with 2 of every kind of animal, because this time, high ground is not enough. This time, the water does not recede within a season. To mainstream scholars, the Atrahasis is a religious narrative explaining human suffering and the origins of death, infant mortality, and famine. The sequence of catastrophes is a literary structure showing divine patience exhausted. It is theology, not chronology. To some alternative researchers, the sequence looks less like theology and more like a manual. Each event has a specific cause, each has a specific warning, each has a specific survival response. The structure is not the structure of myth. It is the structure of a protocol. What happened before, documented precisely enough to be recognized the next time it happens. Imagine finding an instruction document for a machine you did not build. It does not say the machine will break. It says, when you observe these 3 conditions, in this order, the machine is approaching failure. Whether that document was meant as warning or history depends entirely on whether the machine is still running. The Atrahasis was pressed in clay and copied across centuries. So was the King List. Both survived the same empires, the same fires, the same erasures. Something in the culture that produced them decided both were worth keeping. The question is why someone decided to keep both of them. Here is where the translation starts to crack. In 1923, the scholar Stephen Langdon published the first full translation of the Weld-Blundell Prism as part of the Oxford editions of cuneiform texts, Oect Volume 2. His notes include several references to damaged lines, clay that had degraded, sections that could not be fully restored. The cuneiform was present, but illegible in places. This is normal. Clay is fragile. Time is long. What is less normal is where the damage appears. The Eridu Genesis, a separate, older Sumerian flood tablet excavated at Nippur in 1893 and translated in 1912 by the Assyriologist Arno Pobel, contains substantial missing sections. Scholars have long used the Atrahasis epic to reconstruct the probable content of those missing lines. The gap is filled by a different document from a different century because the original text is gone in precisely those passages. The passages that are damaged are the passages that would clarify whether the Sumerian flood was a unique, singular, mythological event or a numbered instance in a cycle. You cannot prove the damage is intentional. Clay breaks. It degrades unevenly. The specific location of the missing lines could be pure erosion. It could be the way the prism was stored. It could be 12 things that have nothing to do with what the lines contained. But it is the kind of absence that does not feel comfortable, like a medical file where the family history page has been torn. Not missing, torn. You cannot prove the tear matters. You only notice that it is in exactly the place it would matter. The CUNLI, the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, has digitized all 4 faces of AN 1923. 444. AI-assisted translation tools have been applied to partially damaged Mesopotamian texts since 2023. The damaged sections of the Eridu Genesis have not been substantially revised. The gaps remain gaps. The annotation still reads, text damaged, text missing, restoration uncertain. Now the number needs to travel. A researcher, not affiliated with any major institution, working independently on numerical patterns in ancient cosmological texts, noticed something about the Berossus version of the King List. Every single pre-flood king's reign, in that version, is an exact multiple of 144. Not most of them, all 8. 0 remainder across the entire set. The probability of this occurring randomly in 8 independent numbers is not high. It is not a matter of interpretation. The math is either there or it is not, and it is there. The mainstream response is that Sumerian base 60 mathematics naturally produces numbers divisible by many factors, including 144. The Sumerian SAR is 3,600 years, and 3,600 divided by 144 is 25. The divisibility is a feature of the number system, not a message, not a code, a consequence of counting in base 60. That answer is mathematically sound, but the same factor, 144, appears in the Hindu Vedic Yuga calculations. It appears in the Norse cosmological framework. It appears in Babylonian astronomical intervals. These are cultures with no confirmed transmission of this specific mathematical convention at the time these texts were composed. The mainstream answer explains the Sumerian instance cleanly. It does not explain all 4 instances simultaneously. And now the midpoint arrives. Because the number does not stay in the ancient world. 432,000 years. 4 civilizations. 1 number. The Sumerians recorded it as the total reign of kings before the flood. The Norse encoded it in the count of warriors before the end of the world. The Hindus inscribed it as the duration of the final cosmic age. The Babylonians preserved it as an exact astronomical fraction of what Berossus called a great year, the time required for all celestial bodies to return to their original positions. 4 separate cultures, 4 separate languages, 4 separate theological systems, the same number, all 4 attached to the same concept, the moment before destruction, the moment before the reset. The Sumerians recorded it in a king list. The Norse recorded it in a war count. The Hindus recorded it in a cosmic age. They were not in contact with each other at the time of composition. They all wrote down the same number. The safe answer is still available. Base 60 mathematics, astronomical convenience, convergent numerology, and perhaps that is correct. But even if it is correct, it does not explain why all 4 civilizations attached this particular number to this particular threshold. The question is not whether this proves anything. The question is why the pattern keeps appearing exactly here. The Sumerian record has one more layer that rarely appears in the standard summary. Before the flood, before any of the 8 kings, before the first descent of kingship, the Sumerian texts describe a category of beings called the Apkallu, 7 of them in most accounts, described as arriving from the sea or from the primordial deep, half human and half fish in their most common depiction. They appear in bas-relief carvings at Nimrud and Nineveh. They are archaeologically real in the sense that the carvings exist and have been catalogued. Their function in the texts is specific. They bring knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, law, architecture, agriculture. They teach and then they leave. The mainstream reading is that the Apkallu are mythological culture heroes, religious symbols of wisdom. Their fish form connects to the Oannes myth recorded by Berossus, a figure who emerged from the sea to teach civilization before submerging again. Symbolic, not literal. What makes this uncomfortable to set aside entirely is the structure of their arrivals. They appear before each civilizational era. They teach. They depart before the catastrophe. The King List records that kingship descended from heaven before the flood and descended again after. According to one reading of the pattern, not the mainstream reading, but a reading that cannot be entirely dismissed, the arrivals and departures are timed, scheduled, occurring at the same intervals the numbers encode. Several of the Nimrud Apkallu bas-reliefs are housed at the British Museum. A number are catalogued but not currently on public display. Their symbolic configurations, the objects they carry, the gestures they make, the positions they occupy relative to the thresholds they stand beside, have been described in specialist literature but are not part of the standard public presentation. This is not suppression. Museums make choices about display based on space, condition, conservation needs, curatorial priorities. The carvings are available to researchers. No one has hidden them. But the specific detail of what they are carrying and where they are standing has not received the same attention as their fish form appearance. And the detail of what ancient Sumerian texts describe beings carrying to humanity before a flood is, according to one alternative framework, considerably more specific than the mythology of divine wisdom typically suggests. The Atrahasis sequence returns here with new weight: plague, then drought, then famine, then the flood. The scribes describe this as history, what happened before, what the gods did, and what humanity survived. But the sequence is not described vaguely. It is described with cause and effect. The noise of overpopulation disturbs the gods. A plague is sent. Humanity survives by following Enki's instruction. The noise resumes. Drought follows. Humanity survives again. Then famine. Then the final event. No one survives without a sealed vessel. The sequence has a logic, not the logic of divine anger expressed as weather, the logic of escalation. Each intervention slightly larger than the last, each survival requiring more than the previous one. And the fourth, the one that required an ark, 2 of every animal, a sealed hull against water that covered the highest ground. The fourth was different in kind, not just in scale. Some alternative researchers have noted that the Atrahasis preconditions, overpopulation, resource strain, iterating plague cycles, drought, food system failure, describe conditions that climate scientists, epidemiologists, and environmental researchers have flagged for the 21st century. This is not proof. These are general conditions that have described civilizational stress in every century of recorded history. The Roman Empire, the Bronze Age collapse, the 14th century. The sequence is not specific to now, but the checklist is longer now than it was in 1923. And the number attached to the interval is still there. The Weld-Blundell Prism and the Berossus version of the King List were composed roughly 1,500 years apart. Different empires, different languages, different scribal traditions. In both versions, the king names vary. They do not perfectly agree on which kings ruled, in which cities, or in which sequence. But the numbers, the lengths of the reigns, the total of the pre-flood period, the unit of measurement, are preserved with precision across both versions. The names drifted, the numbers did not. Think about what that means. Scribes copying a document they did not entirely understand across 15 centuries of political upheaval, cultural shift, linguistic change, preserved the numbers exactly while the names around them evolved. If the document was a king list, the kings were the point. The numbers were supporting data. You do not carefully preserve supporting data while allowing the main content to vary, unless somewhere in the transmission, the supporting data became the content. The king names were changed, the numbers were not. The question worth asking is which part was being protected. Zecharia Sitchin's interpretation of the Sumerian texts, not academically confirmed, widely disputed, rejected by mainstream Assyriology, holds that the pre-flood kings were Anunnaki administrators, beings from elsewhere whose reigns were measured in the orbital cycles of a 3,600-year period. Mainstream archaeology has no framework for that reading and considers it unsupported. But the 3,600-year SAR unit is real. The precision of its application is real. The question of what the Sumerian scribes believed they were measuring when they pressed those numbers into clay has not been definitively resolved. It has been dismissed. Those are not the same thing. The South Atlantic anomaly is a real feature of Earth's present magnetic field, a region where the field is measurably weaker than surrounding areas, and where it is continuing to weaken. Earth's magnetic field as a whole has been declining in strength for centuries at a documented rate. The Lachamp excursion, roughly 41,000 years ago, saw the field drop to approximately 5% of its normal strength. Humanity survived it. The Younger Dryas event, approximately 12,900 years ago, brought sudden, catastrophic climate collapse across the northern hemisphere. Megafauna went extinct. Sea levels shifted. The conditions described in ancient flood accounts, sudden, total, catastrophic, unprecedented in scale, align with the geological signature of that event in ways that scholars acknowledge as worth studying. No mainstream scientist connects this to the Sumerian King List. The intervals do not match confirmed geomagnetic cycles. The predictive framework proposed by some alternative researchers has not been verified by any peer-reviewed institution. The connection between the prism and any coming geophysical event is, at present, speculation. And yet the field is weakening. The interval encoded in the prism is real. The prism was built to be read on a spindle, all four faces in sequence, by someone who needed the entire document in the right order. Those three things are all true simultaneously, without any of them proving the rest. The prism is still in Oxford. It sits in a glass case at the Ashmolean Museum. Museum accession AN 1923.444. The museum description remains two calm paragraphs. The label says King List. The label is not wrong. The official explanation is rational, grounded, and may be entirely correct. The Sumerian scribes were recording royal legitimacy using conventional mathematical exaggeration in a base 60 number system. The flood is mythology. The intervals are aesthetic. The pattern across four civilizations is the coincidence of ancient arithmetic. All of that is possible, but the official explanation does not account for why the numbers survived when the names changed. It does not explain why the same interval appears at the cosmological endpoint of four cultures with no documented contact. It does not explain why a companion text describes preconditions in exact sequential order rather than as general divine displeasure. It does not explain why the prism was engineered to rotate. These are not proofs of anything. They are the loose threads the explanation was never asked to explain, and they did not disappear when the explanation was accepted. The prism was made to spin. It is still spinning. Someone decided that the numbers were the part that had to survive. The label stayed harmless. The clay did not.